Today on The Big Questions, human rights versus religions. Which has achieved more for mankind? Good morning, I'm Nicky Campbell. Welcome to The Big Questions. We're back at the Pyramid in Parr Hall in Warrington to debate one very big question. Has human rights law achieved more for mankind than religion? All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Well, these are the opening words of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, and the specific rights and freedoms granted in its 30 articles were intended for everyone, everywhere, irrespective of their race, colour, sex, language, religion, opinions, origins, property, birth, or any other status. But have these fine words actually achieved more than the religious ideals and beliefs that preceded them for millennia? To debate the question, we've gathered together campaigners, lawyers, humanists, scholars, preachers, former believers on both sides of these arguments this morning. And you can have your say via Twitter or online. Just log on to bbc.co.uk/thebigquestions, where you'll find links to continue the discussion online. And there'll be lots of encouragement and contributions from our very lively Warrington audience. Has human rights law achieved more for mankind than religion? Human rights campaigner over the years, Peter Tatchell, answer the question.
From my research, it's very clear to me that both historically and contemporarily, the single greatest global threat to human rights is organised religion. And that abuse particularly targets women, gay people, and religious and ethnic minorities. Now, I want to add, of course, not all people of faith support their leaderships. So I'm very gratified that although in this country all the main religious leaders oppose the right of gay couples to marry, a poll found that 55% of religious people in Britain supported the right of gay people to get married. So it does show that the leaderships of the organised, established religions are out of touch with the majority of religious people in this country.
You're thinking the worst of religion rather than the best of religion, though. Haven't the religions and belief systems through the millennia, haven't they affirmed, perhaps more and more so as time has gone on, the integrity of the human being?
Well, of course, some of my personal inspirations are people of faith, like Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, people like Archbishop Oscar Romero in El Salvador, who was murdered because he stood up to the American-backed dictatorship. So, of course, I acknowledge and salute those courageous people of faith who have stood for human rights. But overall, around the world today and historically, wherever religion has had power or influence, it has been complicit or active in the abuse of human rights.
So any advances in human rights has been in spite of, rather than because of?
Largely.
Right.
Not entirely,
Okay.
but largely it's been people outside of religion who've challenged religion who've made those changes.
All right, let me come to Linda Rose, Reverend Linda Rose, Voice for Justice UK. Linda, the Ten Commandments is often cited as a perfect essence and distillation of human rights and also human obligations. Nothing in there on children's rights, or slave rights, for that matter. It does talk about not coveting your neighbour's wife, his maidservant, or his ass. It's not exactly feminism or egalitarianism.
No, but with respect, I'd like to move the debate a bit farther back, because I've never heard such rubbish in my life.
As what?
As Peter was just saying.
Oh, Peter was saying, right, okay.
Because if you wouldn't have any human rights were it not for the Judeo-Christian tradition. And you need to go back historically, go back to the legal code of Alfred the Great, which formed the foundation for Magna Carta. And secular power was placed under the power of God. Now, why is that important? Because right at the beginning of the Bible, it says that men and women are created in the image of God. And it is because of that, and only because of that, that they deserve respect and care and honour. And God gives men and women free will and freedom of choice. So again, we are commanded in the Bible to honour the freedom of others. You look to any other society in the world throughout history, and you will find nowhere that men and women are accorded the same value and respect simply by virtue of their humanity. So I'm so sorry, Peter, but whatever you say about abuse of the church, you would not have a human right to stand on whether or not for the heritage that you have benefited from and received from religion.
I acknowledge some good things that religion has done, but overall, I'm saying if you take things in the totality, first of all, it's not just about the Judeo faith. There are Buddhist, Muslim and other traditions that also have similar values to the Ten Commandments and others. So we have to not put this down to us...
And they are people of faith.
Shami Chakrabarti.
I have to say, I think this is a really unhelpful beginning.
Quite.
A really unhelpful
Well, we're not going to
beginning.
start again, Shami.
I think...
But unhelpful from Peter.
Human beings...
What was unhelpful? What Peter said, or what?
He gives his overall assessment that he's been affected positively by some brave people of faith, but in the round, religion is bad. And human beings are creatures of emotion and logic, of faith and of reason, whether they are religious or not. People are frail, people are vulnerable, and they are wonderful. I agree with Linda that many, many people of faith, not just one or two friends of yours, Peter, many people of faith respect human rights because of their belief in the inherent dignity and precious nature of human life. Also, there are people with no faith whatsoever who come to the same conclusion because they're Darwinists or because they understand you can't have democracy without human rights in the rule of law.
But Shami,
No.
for millennia, the churches and all religions...
whole religions...
Hang on.
Peter Tatchell.
For millennia, I've got to say, sadly, for millennia, organised religion has been complicit in the mass oppression of women, of gay people, responsible for slavery, the Inquisition, and all these other abuses.
True, and
we have to face up to that reality.
And equally,
Let me bring Andrew Copson in, and Shami, of course, we'll be back with you later on. Andrew, you were dying to come in. I asked about the Ten Commandments. We didn't get many places became sidetracked, but you did want to come in.
Well, I think one of the best things about human rights, and particularly about the Universal Declaration, which you mentioned at the beginning, is precisely that it's not dependent on one particular culture. I think it's untrue to say that it stems from a Judeo-Christian culture. One of the best things about well, let me tell you why it is untrue. One of the best things about the Universal Declaration in the late 40s is it draws on cultural inspiration and authors from all over the world. There are Confucian scholars there, there are Christian scholars there are humanists there are legal scholars, and that blending of all that is best in human culture to produce these inalienable rights is why human rights are so important and why they have a claim to universalism. That's what's incredible about them. But it's small-minded and parochial and rude to say that somehow your own particular tradition is the sole origin.
And also, of course, one of the most important human rights is freedom of thought, conscience and religion. The right to the faith of your choice, the right to no faith, and perhaps most importantly of all, the right to be a heretic within any faith community. And you cannot separate the struggle for human rights and indeed democracy from people's struggles historically for religious freedom.
But of course, religion, as it has developed, Abdullah, I'll be with you shortly. It's been about our group as against the other groups. It's been a tribal thing, as it has in its embryonic form, and it's spread to a larger group and a larger group and a larger group, apart from cults, of course. And very much there's this problem that it's about the in-group and the out-group. And we'll come on to the universalism of it or not a little bit later on. Well, this is why I want to ask Tim about this, and Marianne, please do come in. Because, for example, women's rights, gay rights, reproductive rights, abolition of slavery, at every stage in the history of advancement of human rights, there have been big elements in the church who have opposed those things.
Yeah, that's true. And, you know, I'm not here to defend organised religion, in inverted commas, but we under that umbrella, there is a mass of individual backgrounds, people of faith in different ways. You know, the organisation is flawed because it is an organisation that tries to defend itself and justify...
But it's right for us and not for you. It's the in-group and the out-group, isn't it? It's them and us.
But that's humanity.
That's not just religion.
That's not just religion. That's political parties.
Hitler, they're not religious movements, are they?
All the great atheists and secular regimes, the Pol Pot, the Maos, the Stalins, you know, they massacred people in their millions. So it's, I think
not because of their atheism.
Well, Peter, we've heard from you.
There's nothing about atheism that motivates...
I understand that, Peter, but just hang on a second. The problem with the premise of the question is that this is a battle between two sides. It is not a battle between two sides. There are thousands, millions of people of faith who believe passionately in human rights. And there are plenty of scriptures around, coming out of Old Testament, New Testament, and other faith scriptures that argue passionately for freedom, that everybody is equal under God, that everybody is equal before the law. It's where Magna Carta comes from. Magna Carta comes out of that period where the church and the state is arguing with itself, and ultimately King John has to accept that he is not above the law. And that is a Christian as well as other things.
I have to agree with Peter. I mean, I think we have to make certain distinctions. One, we're not talking about people, because people live religion or their atheism and their beliefs in a million different ways, and most of it very human. But when you're talking about organised religion, if you look at any religion, if you're a Shia, as let's say I was born into, the Sunnis are not good enough.
This is the in-group, the out-group.
Yeah, if you're a Muslim, the women have half, you know, their testimony is worth half that of a man's. If you're gay, you should be thrown off a building. I'm talking about the tenets.
Say that in the Quran.
It's the tenets of organised religion.
It says the former, but not the latter. Yeah.
All of the death penalty for apostasy, it's in Muhammad's hadith, for example. What I'm trying to say is that, in fact, the difference between religious law versus human rights law is that human rights law puts human beings at the centre, whereas religious law puts divine law and God at its centre.
I want to bring Abdullah in, Linda, if I can. We have time. Time is on our side. Abdullah, I want to explore this in-group, out-group notion as well. And it was mentioned there by Mariam about a woman's testimony is worth half that of a man, and also on the issue of slavery, which figures prominently, of course, in the Old Testament, and also in the Quran. There are different rules for slave women, of course, what your right arm possesses, and also Muslims are barred from enslaving other Muslims. Now, these are very ancient precepts, but it reaffirms this whole notion of them and us.
Actually, I think there's a whole bunch of misconceptions and I think inaccuracies on what you've just discussed regarding what the Quran says and what Mariam has said about it. First and foremost, I wanted to say that the title is Has Human Rights Law Achieved More Than for Mankind Than Religion? And seeing as religion has an idea of what is right and wrong, and how you should treat people, what is right and wrong, and hence give people rights, it's like asking what has achieved more for humanity, Starbucks or coffee, right?
Explore, if I would, this notion about there's us, and we have the truth, we're the chosen ones, we're the believers, we have the ticket to paradise, and you do not. It's all religions have that.
But it's not even...
It's a notion of them and us.
Okay.
Rabbi Jackie will come in and disagree with that point in a second. Carry on, Abdullah.
All right, well, in terms of the Islamic belief system, yes, Islam posits, you know, certain truths which it holds, and it didn't say that it was the only civilization that ever received these truths. Obviously, it was just reiterating a very old truth which has come to many peoples before it. But how we judge righteousness is not just someone saying, I'm this label, but in their conduct as well. So it's belief and good actions being just, which justifies you, not just saying, I'm just this label and now I'm going to be saved. No, it doesn't automatically happen like that. And just because someone doesn't have your belief, the Quran says that, you know, God does not give you an excuse to treat them unjustly or does not forbid you from acting kindly towards them. So just because someone doesn't hold your belief doesn't mean you can treat them as lesser creatures. But the history of Western civilization has treated people all around the world as less than it, caused racial, national divisions, even just till last century. So, and many of these people were going in the name of human rights to civilize the natives of X, Y, and Z country, to spread the human rights. In fact, I would even argue that people argue human rights basis for torture, like the CIA torture report, which said that we can torture people to save the life, the human rights of other people. We can torture other people. So human rights isn't so clear-cut and frequently contradicts itself and causes injustice as well.
I think...
I'll tell you,
that's
there was a lot of issues in the question. There was a lot of issues in the answer. Andrew,
that is completely untrue. By a sort of attempted clever verbal trick, Abdullah has tried to make it seem like 19th century imperialists were big fans of human rights and tried to go around the world exploring. They didn't. Human rights, imperialism is a wrong that has occurred historically. Human rights in the mid-20th century are as much a reaction against that as they are a reaction against everything else. It's false.
Why did all
to
the
try
liberal
and portray-
philosophers of that time support, including John Stuart Mill, who
When
was
you look-
cited as a champion of human rights?
When you look at the when you look at the universal
subjection of
No,
people.
I'm agreeing with you.
Andrew Cobson.
If you just listened, you'd hear I'm agreeing with you. I'm saying that that was wrong. I'm saying that human rights comes after, in the 20th century, as a reaction to that and against other evils that have occurred. If you look at the Universal Declaration, there's an amazing moment in the late 1940s when people from all over the world have come together and said, look at the terrible things that have happened just in the last few decades. There's this brilliant line that these things have outraged the conscience of humanity.
Yeah.
And it's people saying what happened in the past was wrong. Racism as it's occurred hitherto, religious discrimination as it's occurred hitherto, all these violations of dignity that have happened so far, especially in Europe after centuries of religious anti-Semitism. All of these things are wrong.
Well,
and we want a new
wait a minute. I mean, Abdullah makes a point that
And
we'll
that's a
address
beautiful
later on
thing.
as well when we talk about universality, about taking the truth. The Victorians with their muscular Christianity,
But that's not
onward
human
Christian
rights.
soldiers,
That's not-
taking the
that's not
truth to
human
other
rights.
cultures. Other cultures have done that as well, of course, Abdullah, throughout history and other religions. Michael, what about the kind of ossification of thought? If it's in a holy scripture, whether it's the Bible, whether it's the Old Testament, whether it's the Quran or whatever, that people looking at those words and thinking they are immutable.
Yeah, I think with religion, it always depends on who is interpreting the religion. It has always been as though there is one God for the oppressor and another God for the oppressed. So when you look at how religion has been manipulated, whether it is through colonialism, slavery, or the apartheid system, or the processes to deny women their rights, or homophobia, it has always been about who is interpreting these religious traditions. Because at the same time, you also have people like Desmond Tutu, you have the abolitionists, who were religious people. You also had the civil rights movement. In South Africa is a good example where you had the apartheid regime being endorsed on the basis of religious teaching by the Dutch Reformed Church. But at the same time, you also had Desmond Tutu using the same Bible to undermine the apartheid system. So it really comes down to who is interpreting the religion.
But the Bible is used to justify the apartheid system and also to argue against the apartheid
Yes.
I
system.
think this is another good
Mariam.
example of what's wrong with using religion as a basis, because a lot of it is up to interpretation, and that's a fundamental problem. If you're going to wait for someone to interpret women's rights better than the interpretation of the Islamists, you can't wait around for interpretations. And the other problem is that it's people who are in power that decide what the interpretation is. That's going to be the one that's going to be law. And therefore, it's really crucial that we have a basis that's human rights and that people are equal, irrespective of their religion and beliefs, and that it's not a God-given right, but it's an inalienable right by the very fact that we're human beings.
Rabbi Jackie, you haven't heard from Rabbi Jackie yet, Linda, but I promise you, you're on my list.
In a good way, in a good way.
In the best possible way. Rabbi Jackie, first woman rabbi, right?
In this country.
It took a lot in this country. It took a long time. It took a long time. We'll be having women bishops next, goodness me.
40 years and counting.
Yeah. This notion of the in-group and out-group, I mean, Judaism, it's less so in Judaism. It's arguably a more encompassing universal credo, isn't it?
Well, there is in Judaism...
That's a free hit for you.
There is no need, as far as Judaism is concerned, for people to be Jewish to get to heaven. What they have to be is good people. They have to be not killing each other or committing rape or incest, and also to support justice, a system of justice in their society. And if they do that, then there is, in fact, more likely to go to heaven than the rest of us Jews, because we've got all the other commandments to keep as well.
You want to come back, Linda? But you didn't really address the point about the Ten Commandments earlier on, whether that is really a distillation of rights and obligations, all the stuff about... I mean, women, if we're talking about women, that whole bit about do not covet your neighbour's wife, it's not, if I can come back to it, it's not exactly proto-feminism,
You're
is
really
it?
keen on the Ten Commandments, aren't you?
Aren't you?
Well, I thought we were talking about human rights and religion here. And what's really
Why are
kind
you...
of
What, I mean,
bothering me-
isn't the Ten Commandments not important in this at all? Are you...
I think the main... Obviously, the Ten Commandments give lay down rules for how we're to live in order to...
Rules to live by?
Yes, in order to achieve our maximum fulfilment and happiness.
But that phrase, do not covet your
society.
neighbour's wife, what does that say about the position of women in society? The recommended position of women in society?
That phrase, I don't see. Don't covet, you know, other people's, you know...
Why doesn't it say do not covet your...
significant other? I mean, you know,
do not covet your neighbour's husband?
Surely.
Why doesn't it say that?
Well, hang on. I mean, Nick,
maybe you shouldn't do that either.
You've got to look at the time this thing is, where it comes
Attack me from all round here.
The society it comes from.
Yeah, from the society it comes from in which it was written.
Yeah, well, look at the time and period of history it was written and from where it came from. Essentially what it's saying is, do not covet things, other people's stuff, whether it's their wives, their...
I'll see you all later, OK?
Let's not quibble over a bit of text. Let's recognise the reality that half the world's population are women. They are oppressed on a massive scale and face the most humiliating degradation and discrimination. And in nearly most cases, that is supported by organised religion, not by all people of faith.
If you actually look at the Bible, you look at Christ, the way he treated women was amazing. Because
that may be the case.
No, but you see, what you're doing is all the time you're importing social constructs and the evil that all of us, left to ourselves, will choose. You are trying to tie that up to religion. And no, I'm sorry, you can't.
What are religious organisations doing around the world in terms of blocking women's rights? They're blocking women's rights all over the world.
Shami Chakrabarti, you have to acknowledge there is traditionally a problem because of the patriarchal and hierarchical nature of organised religion when it comes to women's rights.
Where I agree with Peter is that I do believe that gender injustice is the greatest injustice on the planet. We've heard about apartheid. This is like an apartheid, not just in one country, not just in one time. It is global and it is millennial. Now, of course, many of the great world religions are very old systems, and therefore they are founded in times that are less enlightened than this one, of course.
But their claims are that they are the unmediated word of God, or that they are divinely inspired. So were they inspired by the times in which they were written,
But religions and religious communities are as rich and diverse as the people within them. And freedom of thought, conscience and religion is an important human right. And I don't want the voice of human rights in this debate to be presented as a jealous, cruel voice that is actually trying to take away people's freedom of conscience. Yes, I agree that faith has inspired some people to perpetrate torture and inquisitions and terrible oppression, but it's also inspired great acts of kindness and charity and comfort and music.
You can't have it both ways. You can't say that human rights is based on the Judeo-Christian tradition and then not want to talk about, and then not want to talk about the Ten Commandments because it doesn't fit anymore. The fact of the matter is, the fact of the matter is, if we agree that it was written for times before, then therefore a human rights culture needs to go beyond religion. If we agree, however great it might have been for that period.
And we need to go beyond Magna Carta as well.
We need to go beyond it.
In 1215. If you read Magna Carta, that's not such a great progressive document,
but the point is it's man-made, and that's the difference. When you have to rely on divine law, you get into a lot of trouble because you have people, like in Iran, you have women still being stoned to death, you have gay people being executed. If you have societies that rely on religion, you get into a lot of trouble.
Is that about religion, or is that about just power structures?
And this is not about religious people, because there are a lot of religious people.
Where does the prejudice come from?
The point is that if you look at ancient texts and you use that as the law, you're going to get into trouble. And even though there are a lot of wonderful religious people, including my parents who are Muslims, who are the most decent people on earth, they're not the ones making the laws. It's the people who are in power. It's ISIS, it's the Iranian government, it's Al-Qaeda who makes the rules.
First of all,
and
ISIS
it's dangerous.
The Spiegel revealed that ISIS were actually controlled by a central cabal of Baathists who are a secular party by
everything goes back to the secular.
Should we talk about let's keep it at human rights. Let's keep it at human rights. Not the spread of Wahhabism and that particularly pernicious
Everything goes back
Sure.
to...
Arguably.
Everything's about interpretation. Everything can be interpreted, in especially secular-based morality systems, which don't have any particular basis,
The problem with Abdullah...
except what some maybe great leader might say, or some constitution that was written 200 years ago in the United States. I mean, you know, King Jong-un is a secular leader as anyone else is.
He always goes back to other...
Wait, Kim Jong-un is a secular leader. He's a totalitarian leader. Secularism everyone is on an equal basis.
Yeah, which shows that secularism doesn't necessarily give human rights. My only point is that basically it's all about interpretation. You can't say the problem with religion is interpretation.
Can I just make one...
Okay, Andrew Copson, are we misunderstanding what secularism means here?
In that little discussion, yes, definitely, because, I mean, secularism is obviously just the idea that the state should try and prevent discrimination and privilege of all of its citizens on the basis of their religion.
So Kim Jong-un is by no means...
Kim Jong-un is certainly not the poster boy for secularism. That's absolutely not the all for anything, in fact. But in fact, what Abdullah is claiming is a flaw in human rights is actually its great strength. This idea that human rights is an act of human will, is a construct of human societies, is very much to its credit. Just as it took an enormous collective global effort of will in the wake of the Second World War and the Holocaust and all those atrocities to establish the idea that every single human being in the world should have their rights as a human being and equally and protected in law, just as that is an act of the human will which is incredibly impressive and we should celebrate, so too is the acknowledgement that the laws that are then enshrined have to be contextual, applied in the real world, not be held to some sort of God-given standard, but be about real people in the here and now. And that's a strength of human rights law.
We haven't heard from Les yet.
To be honest, I'm finding a lot of this conversation, one, it's really confusing me because I just don't understand the premise for half of what is being discussed. Firstly, let's just clear up a few things. One, the Ten Commandments comes from 147 negative confessions of Ma'at. This is from ancient Egypt, right? We hardly ever like to talk about the sources of Judeo-Christianity or Islam. They're rooted in Africa, and that's been proven, okay? People can check that for themselves. Most important thing is, under ancient Egyptian law, because you made a very interesting point about people didn't have whatever kind of, women didn't have rights or whatever. Under ancient Egyptian law, you can check this out for yourselves. Women could divorce their husbands. They had practically the same rights as men, depends on which dynasty you go to, okay? We're talking about stuff that predated all this stuff about Jews being used as slaves and Moses and all this crazy stuff that Hollywood perpetrates to divide us even further. People need to get historically accurate, for one thing. The second thing that I want to mention is, I've had this saying, and I've said it for years, knowledge gives us the power to enslave or liberate. Now, I don't subscribe to any state religion or any orthodoxy. What I think is dangerous is we are taking texts, written documents, out of context and acting as if this one is more pernicious than that. And it isn't. You can use the Bible to liberate or enslave. The Bible was absolutely used to enslave my ancestors, which is why I'm here. William Alastair Anthony Henry. That does not sound like an African name for an African person. Okay?
But William Wilberforce great strength
Well, William Wilberforce, he's another one. Look up Elizabeth Hayrick, I believe her name was. Forget William Wilberforce, because they were for the gradual abolition of slavery. It was the women's movements who put pressure on the Clapham sect and William Wilberforce for the abolition of slavery.
Point taken, absolutely. There's a difference between abolition of slavery and the Atlantic slave trade, but he drew inspiration. What I'm saying is he drew inspiration on the Bible for positive
Absolutely,
ends.
and I think that it's a bit wrong-headed when we're going to condemn that book, whether you believe it's the word of God or not, because I would challenge you to say, then if we're human beings and we are created in the image of God and we are God's essence, then is not everything divinely inspired?
It's not about
that we do.
Adam,
I find it very confusing.
Yeah, I'll be back with you later on. I think you've got great stuff to say about the universality of human rights and so forth. And I want to talk about whether religions are actually an actual, real, tangible barrier to human rights. But Adam, just before we leave our thoughts behind on the in-group and the out-group, is religion in its essence about everybody?
I don't think it necessarily is. I think there's a huge...
The whole human race?
There's a huge range of different kinds of religion, and different kinds of religion do different things.
Tribalism.
And they do come, to an extent, from tribalism, and therefore your tribe gets better rights than another tribe. And human rights says something like the opposite, which is that we don't recognise there's some sort of racial or tribal or religious hierarchy in human society. And in fact, we are going to create liberal societies where all the different tribes and races and what have you
as
get
we've
to live
mixed
together
more,
peacefully
as our lives have...
and with dignity. And that's what human rights is. And I think that there's nothing inimical to human rights in religion, but we do have to look, and we do have to be honest about it, at religious societies now. Forget 2,000 years ago, look at now. Societies governed according to what God says, whichever God it is, tend to be less liberal, less free than societies that are governed by liberal principles. And we have to ask, is that because of religion, or is it because the dictatorial leaders are using religious principles to justify their awful rule? Yeah. But either way, you have to accept, I think, looking at the way societies are run now, that if you set them up according to a Charter of Rights, they are going to... It's a better starting point than starting with a 3,000-year-old book. OK, and as you say, things have changed as we've mixed and we've mingled and we've travelled and we've become... And the in-group has become bigger and bigger and bigger, and the out-group's hopefully smaller and smaller. But on the issue of religions being barriers to human rights, Linda, I mean, you think, don't you, that certain human rights laws are curtailing the rights of some Christians? I know, because you were... Just if I can put it in context, you were recently... you were supporting the bus, I think it was in London, wasn't it, which said, not gay, ex-gay, post-gay and proud. And Boris Johnson put a stop to it, didn't he? He wouldn't have it on London transport. And you wanted to promote gay cures, and a lot of people have been very hostile towards you because of that. Do you feel your rights have been curtailed? Well, the point behind that bus campaign was it was in response to the Stonewall. Some people are gay, get over it. And the counter advert was simply trying to draw attention to the fact that actually sexuality is pretty much on a sliding scale, and some people are not happy with their sexual orientation and want help to strengthen their heterosexual feelings. So, no, so it wasn't... But it's your right to put that view forward. Oh, yes, as was acceptable. Do you feel that there are certain human rights that are trampling on your rights or seeking to curtail your rights? The problem is, if you look at human rights, you get, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you look at the protected characteristics under the Equality Act, you've got a whole range of things, one of which are religion and conscience, but at the moment it feels in this country as if a very narrow band of rights which have to do with sexual rights and gender orientation, are being prioritised over other rights. So it is saying... The rights to promote gay cures and so forth. No, come on, no, that's a red rag to the bottom. No, it's not just gay cures. Not just gay cures. Standing... It's not gay cures at all. It's helping people who want to change their feelings. There's no idea of gay cure. I completely disagree about that, but I will say... While we're on that issue... Can I just finish this? Yeah. It's actually about the rights of Christians to articulate their faith, to quote scripture. We're having cases where street preachers are being arrested because they're reading the Bible in public. Now, how is that maintaining freedom of religion? Should people of Linda's persuasion and faith, the part of the faith that she occupies, not have the right to say, for example, not gay, ex-gay, post-gay and proud on the buses in London?
Absolutely, they have that right, even though I disagree with them.
Thank you, Peter.
And I have defended many religious preachers, Muslim, Judaist and Christian, who have been arrested unfairly for simply expressing their point of view. I think that's wrong. That's an abuse of their human rights. But where I disagree is when some Christians want to defend the right to discriminate. Yeah. They say that, as Christians, they should be able to discriminate against others who they disagree with. For example, the bed and breakfast owners who wanted to turn away a gay couple, or did turn away a gay couple. Well, actually, that is an act of discrimination. I make a distinction.
The couple that you're mentioning, they would not allow any unmarried couple to share a bedroom. So gay couples couldn't be married at the time. No, but that's not the point. Their religious position was, and they made no secret of being a Christian couple. If people were going to share a room, they had to be married. So, a long-term...
But Shani Chakrabarti, there is a significant, and Linda is a representative of it, and we've discussed this before, a significant minority of possibly a minority of Christians, I don't know, but a significant amount of Christians in this country who feel that their rights are being encroached upon.
And at Liberty, well, all sorts of people's rights occasionally get encroached upon, which is why you need the Human Rights Act. And the Human Rights Act, under Article 10, creates your only positive right to free speech in this country. And if you did go to court, you talk as if you went to court, I am sure that you will have used Article 10 of the Human Rights Act, which is the first positive right to free expression. There's nothing in Magna Carta about free expression. I do, however, agree with Peter that if you are... I mean, there is the private, there is conscience, there is, you know, and I will defend anybody's right if they're not inciting violence and murder to say things, terrible things about me as a woman, as an Asian woman, whatever. That, I believe, is their right. But at the same time, if you are offering goods and services to the public, just like those people who, when my parents came to London in the late 50s, said no blacks, no Irish, no, you know, then I think you are in the public square in a way that means that we're allowed to say no.
I'm not defending.
OK, let's first of all...
I'm not defending what she said, but again, you've quoted her out of context. Because if she said that the hotel's policy was for no one who is married to have a room, it doesn't matter what your politics are or your sexual orientation, that's what it is. So deal with it as it is. Because I remember having discussions with my students when that occurred, and I said, if you have a policy, if that was my guest house, and I said, I don't care who you are, if you're not married, you're not sharing a room, that's the policies of my guest house. Whether you agree with it or not, or whether Judeo-Christian sensibilities underpin that or not, is moot. That's not important. What is important is they have said that.
I'm going to be back in a minute, and Abdullah, I promise.
Sorry,
I agree.
Nikki, sorry, one second. No, let me just finish this point. The reason why I say this is because you can sit here, OK, and say what you like, but as somebody who's of African ancestry, born in this country, gone through the stuff I've been through, like working as a contractor in Deal, when they didn't even want to put me up in a room, working uptown when I was 16, having to have a letter from the solicitor I worked for in Blackheath. You're shaking your head, but you don't know, because no one's probably ever told you. I used to have a letter, 1973, when I was 16 years old, to stop the police from arresting me uptown, when I had a suit on, working for a solicitor. Those were impinging and infringement on my human rights. So what I'm saying is, just because people have a policy where they say, we don't want to accept this, how can that be discriminatory practice if they lay it out there? That's what it is.
Why is there so much... Let's move it on. I know this is an issue that you've spoken about before. Why is there so much homophobia in the Caribbean?
Is there more homophobia than the people who taught us how to be Christians? Because where did that come from? Do you know you can still hang people in Jamaica under British law? No, hold on a second. You're talking about human rights. Let's have a real conversation. Do you know that under British law you can hang people in Jamaica, but you can't hang people in here?
This is a problem. Shamina said this is a problem, Tim Cross. It's what we were saying earlier on. It's onward Christian soldiers, 19th century missionaries going there, trampling on cultures,
absolutely, and then you're blaming people for what they're
in a patronising, patriarchal way.
Peter's there, and if Peter is honest enough. When we had our discussions, sorry, Nicky, very quickly, when we had our discussions about homophobia and reggae music, remember one of the things I said to you on more than one occasion was, how do these Jamaican MCs justify their homophobia? And it was always scriptures. Leviticus this, Leviticus... It was never my granny said it or my father said it. It was always biblical. So let's deal with the root of the issue.
So basically, I agree with him about the experience, the deep, deep experience of prejudice and discrimination and how...
That's not prejudice, it's racism. Okay, let's call it what it is.
OK, racism. But it's because of that history of racism that comes to a terrible culmination in things like the Holocaust, that the principle against discrimination is such an important principle in human rights law.
But do you really believe in that, considering that Theresa May and the Tory government have waxed lyrical about fighting non-violent extremists as defined by them, which is basically just the secular word for heretic. And they're telling Muslims what we can believe and what we can't believe, which is interfering in our religious life, a secular state interfering in a religious belief, and it's been mirrored in Europe, where France banned the hijab for women in schools, niqab, upheld by the European Court of, finish the sentence, human
and it was wrong.
rights.
And in my view...
And this is why we see hypocrisy with the conduct of human rights.
Look, I agree with you.
Will you be leading the vanguard against the government to prevent them from criminalising...
Will somebody let Shami speak?
We've defended religious... We have used the Human Rights Act and the European Convention on Human Rights to defend the rights of people of faith to wear the hijab, to wear the cross, to speak, to say things that I disagree with. That's what these instruments are about. Now, courts aren't always right, just like politicians aren't always right, but we still need these principles
Tim Cross.
to unite around.
Tim Cross, my point about the 19th century Christian missionaries who came from this country, and we took our sense of superiority and other people's what we assumed was cultural inferiority, and we trampled over nations, and was what Les was saying earlier on. We've got a lot to answer for, haven't we? 19th century British Christians, David Livingstone, I presume, and others.
Well, I think it's a bit unfair on David Livingstone. He's actually quite a good bloke. But of course, some of what you say is inevitably true. I mean, again, the debate seems to be pitting one side against the other. I don't think it's very helpful.
That's why you're in the middle.
Of course, some of the things that religious leaders have done over the centuries has been terrible. And it is an important comment, as have secular organisations and atheist regimes that have killed, massacred millions of people. The issue that we've
British
taken
colonialism
out,
here.
Okay, but we've taken out the Christian missionaries. Going back to your point, we're taking out a message which is essentially a message of equality and love.
No, they weren't.
Now, did they get it wrong? Of course they did. They're flawed. They're human beings.
Equality and what?
And love. The Christian message.
Missionaries?
Yeah.
Well, why do you look so astounded that the missionaries believed that love was an important word? I'm sorry if you're embarrassed by the word love, but, you know, that's the essence of the gospel. God is love. That's what the gospel is.
I want to get Les's response to that.
This is
I find that kind of extra. I think you need to go and read maybe some of the old slave masters' tales about who they imported over and as to why, and what their role was.
That's not
what
I'm
nothing
talking
about spreading love amongst the natives. All right, let me explain to you this way, okay? As an African person, I was part of the forces of production. This is why when people say to me, oh, what class are you, Dr. Henry? I ain't no class. I'm working class when I'm a whatever. I was part of the forces of production. Missionaries went over to places in Africa or wherever in the Caribbean to create a labour force who accepted, almost under like the Calvinist doctrine, they would never know whether they were elect of God, but they knew they were here to labour as hard as they could, because people in positions of power told them they need to do so.
But
so all this about
we need to move it on. It wasn't a lot
not
of,
for African people.
A lot of that
no
stuff
way.
was
a
lot of that stuff was dressed up in the clothes of the missionary, wasn't it?
Yeah, sure.
But what I'm saying, Nicky, unequivocally, it was never for African people. They were always taught they were beasts of burden.
Okay, Peter
Let's
Tatchell.
get that straight.
Peter Tatchell.
Written into all Britain's equality laws is the right for religious organisations to discriminate. And religious organisations made sure that they were given that exemption, that they should be able to discriminate, particularly against lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender people. That's enshrined in law. And when that bill was going through Parliament, all the major religious leaders championed that they should be exempt from the equality laws. Right now, in Northern Ireland, with the support of many religious leaders, there's a so-called conscience bill before the Northern Ireland Assembly that will allow religious people to discriminate against anybody whose beliefs and behaviour they disagree with. This is in Britain in 2015.
Just briefly, before we talk about freedom of expression, which I want to address, women's rights, much misunderstood, I'm sure, in the Quran. Because we have to say that before the Quran was a step forward in many ways for women's rights, wasn't it? Women had property rights and rights of divorce that in the pre-Islamic Arabian Peninsula just were unheard of and unthought of. But if, I mean, you're a Muslim, you want to spread the word, you would like the whole world to be Muslim, and that's fine, that's the nature of your faith, as Tim would like everybody to be Christian. If we did have proper Sharia law in this country, would women have more rights than they do now, in a sense?
I would actually say, to a lot of degrees, if I said, well, yes, but let me qualify that before everyone hangs me for saying that.
Yeah. In what ways?
In Islam, we believe that women have the right to demand of their husband financial support, his time, and even sexual satisfaction, of which she can seek legal redress if he just neglects her. So, but in an individualistic society, obviously in marriage, no one can compel anyone else or have any legal redress against each other for any obligation,
what if she doesn't
right?
want a husband? I'm interested. What if the woman who doesn't want a husband?
Then she doesn't get married.
I mean, I'm sorry, this is...
But the
I want to hear Abdullah
no, I'm saying, no, I think within the marriage, so these are rights within the marriage, a woman can demand of her husband that he provide for her needs and even take him to court when he's not doing that. In marriage, in the modern sense, you can't do that. There is no rights anyone has from each other to each other.
Outside marriage. So if you have your Sharia society and there are women who want to work and engage and be involved in politics... No, but say there were your perfect Sharia society, what rights would women have outside marriage just to be adults working and living in the world?
Well, how long have you got? The right to work, the right to keep their income, which they can do in marriage as well, and the right to vote. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ took the Pledge of Allegiance from both, he requested from both men and women. Right? So we gave women the right to vote 1,400 years ago. We didn't have to wait for suffragettes and
Abdullah, I think the rights of women in Islam is a really fascinating issue. Do you think in some ways that women in what you described as the individualistic society that we have now have fewer rights than they think?
Well, I would say that, I mean, this is probably a debate that you've probably had between men's rights activists and feminists as to, and within feminists themselves as to whether women are happier now in a modern society whereby...
Are you not a feminist? Do you not believe in equality for women?
I believe equality in the eyes of God with all human beings, but doesn't mean I'm necessarily a feminist because I'm not a gender sectarian in that sense.
But everywhere that Islam has political power, women are denied rights. You're talking theory. The reality is that in every Muslim country in the world today, women are treated as
Mariam.
Can I just say something?
That was interesting.
There's 2 points here. One is what you said about women being treated better in the past, and I think we always hear about that. For example...
The step forward the Quran made it.
Yeah,
that's undeniable, isn't it?
One of the things, as an example, they say is that in Surah Al-Nisa, for example, before you're allowed to beat your wife, you have to first, make her obey, and if she doesn't, then you have to keep her away from your bed, and if she doesn't listen, then you can beat her. And then some will say, well, you can beat her with a feather or with a stick, make sure no marks show on her body, and they say this is a step forward because in the past women were beaten without any hesitation. What I want to say is this is the problem. First of all, today in the 21st century, and even then, no woman should be beaten, not with a feather, not with marks, not without marks, and so on and so forth.
Quick response, Abdullah.
The other issue, sorry, can I just add one more thing? The other issue is, as he said himself, you don't need further clarification. He said women are equal under Islamic law. And that's what we see in many countries, like Iran, like Saudi Arabia, under Islamic law. Women and men are not considered equal. They are seen to be complementing each other.
Quick response.
Which is why women have no rights.
First and foremost,
have no rights whatsoever.
Most of the laws that you're seeing in Muslim countries were bequeathed to us by the British Empire 100 years ago, including laws against homosexuals as well.
What about what he does every time you ask him about Islam, he talks about something else.
What I did was wait a minute.
What about
wait,
what about
please?
Thank you. Let me speak, please.
What about
Cole, calm down now.
Yeah, well,
okay, listen. I set the parameters. I want a 20-second response because I want to move it on, if that's all right.
Sure.
Right of response.
Okay. So basically, when we saw, for example, British taking over Egypt from the Muslim authorities, they actually threw out women out of education, where women beforehand had the right to education under Islamic authorities. So women lost rights under colonialism, and colonialism has been responsible for the current Middle East as it is. And I'm the biggest critic of the Muslim governments as of today, because they're not Islamic and they're not going back to their origins.
OK, well, it's fascinating to hear all this perspectives. Michael, quick word. I want to talk about the universality of human rights in a second, and I'm going to start with you on that one, Shami Chakrabarti, but Michael first.
Yes, I was going to say that the fact that we have Islamic feminism, which is one of the most important movements in contemporary Islam, suggests that there is a problem in terms of how women are viewed within Islamic traditions. Otherwise, it wouldn't exist. So the view that, Islam grants women their rights, it doesn't explain the whole picture. Yes, it depends on who is interpreting that tradition. If it is interpreted by Islamic feminists, they would see it as granting them their rights and so forth and so on. But if it is interpreted by men, then they only limit the rights of women to what happens within marriage. They wouldn't, of course, expand those rights to...
Open to interpretation.
Exactly, to people who are not
kind of
married.
Phrase, Michael, isn't it? Now, universality. Shami Chakrabarti, what right have we got to make cultural impositions on others? I mean, we made a, many people think quite rightly, we made a huge fuss when there was a cultural imposition curtailing our right to mock religion recently. Many people felt that was a cultural imposition. It's something we have a brave tradition of in Britain and France and Western Europe. We fought hard for it. But turning it the other way round, what right have we got to say to people, you should have our human rights, you should educate your daughters, you should raise the age of consent to 18, you should stop flogging people who write blogs that you disagree with? You know, is it any of our business?
Yes, it is our business, because, you see, I believe in multiple identity. There are people in this room who are my fellow women, there are people in this room who are of faith and no faith, and we're entitled to those multiple identities, but the ultimate identity is that of being a human being. And why do we care about other people's daughters? Because if you believe in human rights, you believe in other people's children, and you love other people's children as you should love your own. And so somebody else's daughter on the other side of the planet is not fit for torture and rape and genital mutilation any more than a daughter of anyone in this country. And I'm afraid that's
what if it's... Oh, OK, Peter, what if it's a democratic choice of a country? If you had a...
It's not the choice of the girl that's being raped,
Well, if you had a referendum in Afghanistan on whether there should be gay marriage equality, they'd say, you know, an unequivocal no, wouldn't they? Do we not have to respect...
protect against the majority.
Exactly.
That's what human rights is. It's about protecting minorities against populism.
Andrew Copson.
That's exactly right. I mean, that's what human rights does. Human rights guarantees that even if 99% of the society vote that you should be tortured, you're not going to be tortured, because the rest of the world, if they're watching and available, and other governments, if they're going to intervene, other people are going to be watching out for your rights.
This is so important, because we've had a lengthy debate about whether religion and human rights are compatible. Some people, some of our politicians, try and argue that democracy and human rights are not compatible, as if when you win an election or you form a coalition, you then get a blank cheque to do what you like. You do not, because there is no democracy without fundamental rights and freedoms and the rule of law.
Jack in a second, but just while we're on this, what position are we in? It goes back to the 19th century point in a way. What position are we in to lecture anyone? Look at the Guantanamo Bay. Look at the rendition, our complicity in torture. Look at all the other issues that we have been engaged in as well. Double standards. Look at the racial killings on the streets of America.
Do I approve of those things? No, I don't.
But how can we lecture anyone?
I'm not lecturing anybody.
How could we lecture anyone?
Well, we can't. In the context of the points you make, we can't. But on the other hand, frankly, I get rather bored with everything being blamed on the Brits. You know, we did not go around doing half the stuff that people talk about. We can't bring everything back to saying it's all the faults of the Brits. We can't go around imposing on people. On the other hand, I absolutely agree with the idea that these rights are universal. The issue is, how do you set about bringing them about? Now, invading countries is not the right answer. I've been pretty public about that. So, you know, you cannot force the issue on people. But we do live in a world where we know much more about what's going on in all these places of the world, and we are absolutely right to highlight it, and we're absolutely right to get on the streets and talk about it and get the legislation passed to try and bring this thing about. But we are not... We do have to be careful about having double standards. We can't be lecturing people 1 minute about this is the right way to do it, and then because we decided to make it differently, we're going to go back and now lecture them.
Not about lecturing.
It's a lesson. I want to hear from Rabbi Jackie, if I may. Andrew, very quickly then.
Very dangerous.
You've persuaded me.
Thank you, because there is something very dangerous about the premise of your question. You say, who are we to lecture other people about human rights? That's not what's happening, right? The person who is being tortured in a prison in Bangladesh for exercising their right to free expression is not saying, please come and colonise me with your Western constructs. They're saying, please defend my human rights.
Indeed.
So you're using the language of the oppressor.
Rabbi Jackie, I'm so sorry to have not come to you sooner, but things were flying around a bit there.
That's all right.
Yeah, give us some wisdom, rabbinic wisdom.
To me, the Human Rights Act is very similar to the messianic type of vision that many different religions hold. We hold a dream of a future where there will be no oppression. And it's incredibly difficult to know how to get to that, because I agree with you totally. Invading a country and killing people is really against their human right to live, let alone anything else, the basic human right. So it's about every individual taking responsibility of modelling our lives, of not being this hypocritical society where we as a society, condone going against the human rights of so many people in our country or in Guantanamo Bay or whatever. And that is incredibly against all religious norms and values that we should hold.
But you see,
so we have to hold this dream. Yes. And Judaism...
We have a dream.
We have a dream, absolutely. I have a dream. We all have a dream, I hope. But the dream...
Will we ever get there?
The dream has to be...
We won't, actually.
Yeah. Well, you know, dreams are good.
Can I make
we have to actually, though, always make sure that we back our dreams with action.
But, Rabbi...
Judaism teaches very strongly that you can't... Judaism doesn't talk, actually, very much about human rights. Judaism talks about human obligations. We have obligations and responsibilities to the vulnerable, to the poor, to ensure that people are seen as individuals made in the image of God, who made many different types of individuals, and all are made in the image of God. And that means we have to act.
By reciprocity, human rights are responsibilities also, because you cannot defend them without the obligation to defend them. But just one point, the Human Rights Act is not a utopian or messianic vision. It's because we know that people aren't perfect, and that powerful people will abuse their power, that we have these protections against the abuse of power. And that's ultimately what the Human Rights Act is about. It's our modern Bill of Rights that protects us from the vulnerable, in particular, from abuses of power.
And Adam, the rule of law is all important here. The law to actually make sure that we abide by these principles.
The whole point about human rights, in the modern sense, is they're not a dream. They are enforceable, they are legal, and if your rights are being breached by a public authority, you can go to a judge in your local court and you can say, "Judge, my human rights are being breached," and the judge has to do something about it if you've got a case. So that's the big difference. They are not dreams. They are real things that real people can use in hospitals, in schools, against the army, against their MPs. They're not perfect, and in their application they're not perfect, but they do exist, and they're a pretty good attempt. And don't forget, every country in the world almost signed up to the Universal Declaration.
But not quite.
Well, I mean, North Korea is not such a big UN fan, but almost every single... This isn't just a Western thing. Almost every single country in the world signed up to that Universal Declaration.
Nick talked about the dream, you see. I agree with you that in this country we have laws, and they're great.
Some people want to scrap the Human Rights Act in this country. What kind of a signal will that send to the world?
Allow me to get Abdullah in the time we have.
But it's not just a dream. You were talking about universally.
Yeah.
And for me, universally, that's the messianic dream.
Do you think...
Because there's so many countries who've signed up to the Human Rights Act. And if you look
Universal
at what
human
their
rights.
own country,
Rabbi Jackie, thank you. Abdullah, this concept of universal human rights, you are if you're in a Bangladeshi prison, you're suffering. If you're a young gay man in Jamaica and you take a terrible beating, you're suffering the same way that a young gay man all over the world is. So we have to have a universal level of human rights. Is that possible?
I also want to add, if you're a Muslim in Guantanamo Bay, you need to have someone, protecting you, or someone exiled by Theresa May. So what I would say is...
It depends who they are, but anyway,
well, I mean, I said if they haven't been convicted by court, you have to, you can't punish them.
Absolutely.
It's what the Magna Carta does say, which needs to be reread by our current government, I think. Right. Anyway, but what I would say about universality, first and foremost, I'll say that I think we all agree here that oppression, suffering, torture and killing is wrong. People who are just trying to go about their lives don't deserve any of those.
Whether it's in the name of religion or the state, it's wrong.
Yeah, or ideological nationalism or whatever. In any way, it's wrong. But sometimes when you talk about universality, we make the assumption there's one interpretation of human rights, even amongst human rights activists themselves, right? Even secular activists, they disagree on points. So we can't apply one blanket template, because then we'd be totalitarian in that sense. So what I'll say is just recognise there is some difference.
I think
there are
the
differences.
The fact of the matter is that no society or community is homogeneous, and there is conflicts and dissent even within the places called the Islamic world. Sharia law, for example, is deeply challenged. The veil in Iran, there's a huge movement against the veil in Iran. So what I want to say is that, in fact, universality is a reality, and we need to believe in it in order to show human solidarity.
Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you for taking part. As ever, the debate will continue on Twitter. Thank you for watching. Join us next Sunday from Oxford, back on BBC One. Goodbye from everyone here in Warrington, and have a really, really good Sunday. Thanks for watching.